What if I told you that a single woman once turned an entire empire into her private chessboard? That she didn't conquer with armies, but with glances, whispers, and the softest touch of her hand. For centuries, her name was erased from royal records, her portraits destroyed, her letters burned, but hidden beneath the dust of forgotten vaults, a few fragments survived. Diaries stained with perfume and tears, letters written in coded desire, and one chilling confession. They reveal the story of a queen who seduced her way to absolute power. A woman so dangerous that even death couldn't silence her legend. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear isn't a love story. It's a warning about what happens when beauty becomes a weapon and desire turns to domination. This is the forbidden tale they never wanted you to know. The rise and ruin of the queen who seduced princes to gain political control. The palace stood like a jeweled tomb beneath a blood-red sky. Candles flickered along the corridors, their flames bending in the heavy air, as if afraid of the silence that lingered there. Outside, the city roared with celebration. Trumpets, drums, and cheers rising from the crowd. But within those marble walls, the atmosphere was heavy, suffocating, ceremonial. She moved through it like a shadow in silk. The queen-to-be was barely 20. Her gown shimmered with stitched gold, but her eyes were colder than the crown that awaited her. Every movement was deliberate, a calculated grace she had perfected long before this night. When she smiled, courtiers sighed. When she spoke, they leaned in to listen. Yet, no one noticed the quiet tremor in her hands as she passed beneath the arches of the throne room, where the air smelled faintly of iron and roses. The old king sat slumped upon his throne, skin as pale as candle wax. Rumors said he had not risen from that seat in months. His crown, heavy and crooked, glimmered faintly in the torchlight. When she approached, he looked at her, not as a father might look upon a daughter, but as a dying man might study the sea before drowning. She bowed, not out of reverence, but to hide her smile. The priest's voice echoed like a dirge. The ceremony began. Jewels clinked. Prayers murmured. The crown descended slowly, almost unwillingly, until its metal kissed her brow. In that instant, something in her changed. The hall erupted in applause, but she barely heard it. The roar outside the palace grew louder, the sound of thousands chanting her name. Yet she only felt the pulse of her own heart, steady, deliberate, victorious. Later that night, the old king's breath failed. Some said he died from age. Others whispered the wine had been sweetened with something unnatural. But no one dared to question it. By dawn, black banners fluttered from the ramparts, and the new queen stepped out onto the balcony to greet her people. Her veil drifted in the cold wind, her hands gloved in white silk. The crowd below saw purity, devotion, a radiant young monarch bathed in light. But those closest to her saw something else, a stillness too precise, a calm too deliberate. Behind that beauty was calculation, hunger, a darkness perfectly concealed behind every gentle smile. As the bells tolled and the sun rose over the golden spires, she whispered beneath her breath, words no one could hear, promises meant for no god and no man. The empire cheered for its savior, never realizing that in that moment it had crowned its own undoing. And somewhere in the shadows, her first pawn, a nervous young prince from the eastern provinces, waited to be summoned. Dawn returned to the palace draped in fog, softening the marble courtyards into pale illusions. The new queen stood by the window of her chamber, the crown resting on the table beside her. It caught the morning light, sharp as a blade. She traced its edges with a fingertip, not out of affection, but as a reminder of what she now owned. Her ladies whispered behind embroidered fans. Some said she prayed every morning. Others claimed she never slept, but in truth, she spent those quiet hours listening to footsteps in the hall, to the crackle of the hearth, to the rhythm of a kingdom still unsure of her. Every sound was information, every silence an opportunity. The first prince arrived before noon. He came as an emissary from the eastern border, bearing gifts of silver falcons and a sword with rubies in its hilt. He was young, proud, easily flattered. the kind of man who mistook attention for affection. The queen welcomed him with a smile that seemed almost tender. She spoke little, but each word was chosen like a seed she knew would grow. Over the next few weeks, the palace transformed into her theater. Dinners stretched past midnight, corridors filled with laughter that never quite reached the heart. The prince found himself drawn to her, not just to her beauty, but to the quiet danger that surrounded her. When she looked at him, he felt as though the world held its breath. When she touched his arm, he forgot the name of his homeland. Servants began to notice the change. The prince no longer spoke to his advisors. He stopped writing letters home. His meals went untouched, his eyes hollowed by obsession. The queen's presence became his air, and without her, he could not breathe. One night, during a private banquet, she handed him a cup of spiced wine. He drank it without hesitation. She raised her own goblet, but never sipped. The conversation drifted from poetry to politics, from affection to loyalty. Then his hand began to tremble. He looked at her, confused, but her expression remained calm, almost sorrowful. By morning, the prince's chamber was sealed. The official statement called it illness brought from his homeland. His attendants swore he had been pale for days. Only the queen knew the truth. The same poison she once tested on rats now rested in his veins. At the next council meeting, no one mentioned his death. Instead, they spoke of the queen's grace in tragedy, her composure, her strength. She accepted their sympathy with lowered eyes, hiding the spark of victory beneath her lashes. Outside, the fog lifted. The banners of mourning fluttered across the palace walls, black silk against stone. Inside, the queen stood before her mirror, unblinking. In the reflection, she saw not grief, but power taking shape, quiet and unstoppable. The game had begun, and she was already winning. The palace changed after the prince's death. Not in ways the public could see. The torches still burned, the musicians still played. But something beneath the surface shifted. Conversations grew quieter. Courtiers began to watch one another with suspicion. Servants walked more softly, as if sound itself might betray them. The queen's presence lingered everywhere, even in rooms she never entered. She began to study her court, like an artist studying a canvas. Each noble had their color, their flaw, their weakness. She never raised her voice, never made threats. She didn't need to. A whisper placed in the right ear could travel faster than any messenger. A glance across the table could end an alliance. In the evenings, she walked through the Hall of Mirrors, a vast corridor lined with silvered glass, reflecting endless versions of her. Candlelight fractured her image into dozens of shimmering ghosts, each one bowing, smiling, plotting. She liked to pause there, alone, and watch herself from every direction. It reminded her that truth, like reflection, could be bent by angle and light. Soon, her influence seeped through the palace like perfume, invisible but unmistakable. The chief advisor began seeking her approval before every decision. The high priest altered his sermons to flatter her name. Even the guards at the gate stood straighter when she passed, as though sensing her invisible hand on their shoulders. Behind the scenes, she built her quiet empire. Servants carried messages between rooms, coins changed hands, and secrets became currency. No one noticed the web forming, a delicate network of loyalty and fear. Her most trusted handmaiden delivered coded notes to noble wives, turning gossip into a weapon sharper than any sword. One night, during a masquerade, the queen appeared wearing a silver mask that hid half her face. The court gasped at her beauty, but those closest saw the danger in her stillness. She danced with ministers, laughed with generals, and whispered things they would later deny hearing. By dawn, 3 political rivals had resigned their posts. No one could explain why. When morning light bled through the stained glass windows, she sat alone in the throne room, her mask resting beside her. She stared into the polished marble floor and saw her reflection warped by cracks in the stone. For a moment, she smiled, not out of joy, but satisfaction. The court now moved as she desired, even when she slept. Her crown no longer felt heavy. Her eyes no longer trembled. And for the first time, she realized the truth. She didn't rule by law or divine right. She ruled because everyone had begun to believe she could destroy them with a single look. The palace woke one morning to the toll of the chapel bell. Its sound cut through the mist like a knife, ringing far longer than tradition allowed. In the east wing, guards stood frozen outside a locked door. The chamber of Prince Darius, the second son of a powerful neighboring kingdom. When they finally broke it open, the stench of perfume and spilt wine drifted into the hall. The prince lay lifeless on the floor, his mouth tinted violet. Whispers began before the body was even carried away. Some said it was poison, others heartbreak. A few dared to suggest that the queen herself had been seen slipping into his quarters the night before, her white cloak trailing across the marble like smoke. No one repeated it loudly. By midday, the court was electric with tension. Letters vanished from desks. Servants were questioned, then dismissed. The high priest ordered the chapel bells silenced until further notice. At dusk, the queen appeared on the balcony, veiled in mourning black, her voice trembling as she addressed her people. Her words were soft, deliberate, steeped in sorrow. She spoke of unity, of the cruelty of fate, of her personal grief. By the time she withdrew, tears glimmered in the eyes of even her harshest critics. But that night, while the palace slept, she walked the corridors barefoot, her gown whispering across the stones. She entered the Hall of Mirrors again, carrying only a candle. Its flame reflected across 100 panes, turning her into a crowd of identical mourners. In each reflection, her expression was different: grief, serenity, triumph. She lingered before the one that looked back without emotion. Outside, the city buzzed with rumors. Some claimed the prince's final letter had named her. Others swore he had taken his own life after being refused. The truth was simpler, colder. He had learned too much. He had asked the wrong question. By the week's end, the council demanded a public inquiry. The queen agreed without hesitation. She appeared in the grand chamber dressed in pale silver, her neck adorned with a chain of black pearls. Her voice remained steady as accusations were read aloud. When she lifted her gaze to the crowd, every man who had doubted her fell silent. The inquiry concluded before sunset. No guilt, no trial, only sympathy. That evening, a new portrait of her was unveiled. She stood surrounded by lilies, the symbol of purity. The artist had painted her eyes just slightly downcast, as though weighed by sorrow. But those who looked longer saw something else behind them. A flicker of satisfaction, a promise of further ruin. By the next dawn, her popularity soared higher than ever. And yet, beneath the marble floors, two maids whispered of what they had seen that night. The queen returning from the east wing, her gloves stained faintly purple, her expression calm and unbothered. The scandal that should have destroyed her instead made her untouchable. The court had fallen in love with its own monster. Spring arrived late that year, as though even the seasons hesitated to enter her domain. The palace gardens bloomed unevenly. Roses blossomed beside dying vines, a strange mix of beauty and decay that mirrored the queen herself. She spent her mornings walking those paths alone, the hem of her gown brushing dew from the stones. To the people she seemed serene, to the court untouchable. Then came the envoy from the Northern Empire, Prince Alaric, son of a ruler known for his armies and suspicion. He arrived with 30 guards, a convoy of gifts, and eyes that never stopped studying her. His presence unsettled the palace. He spoke little, smiled less, and carried himself as if the air itself owed him respect. For the first time in months, the queen felt something unfamiliar: interest. Their first meeting was brief. He bowed. She offered her hand, and their eyes met like dueling blades. Conversation was polite, but beneath the surface, both measured the other's worth. She saw ambition, pride, a hunger not unlike her own. He saw elegance sharpened into danger. Neither trusted the other. Both were intrigued. In the following weeks, diplomacy became theater. Banquets stretched deep into the night. The queen sat surrounded by flickering candlelight, every gesture deliberate, every silence planned. She allowed Alaric to believe he was the one leading their conversations, steering the negotiations. In truth, she guided him like a musician, drawing music from a string. She learned the stories he didn't tell, of his father's temper, of his doubts about succession, of the weight of legacy pressing down on his shoulders. She used those secrets as invisible threads, weaving them gently into her words. When she spoke, he listened too closely. When she smiled, his guard slipped. One evening, she invited him to walk the gardens after a storm. The air was thick with petrichor. The torches glowed against the damp marble. They spoke softly, their voices echoing between statues. She told him of her dreams, of peace, of unity, of a world ruled by reason rather than fear. He believed her. He wanted to. When she placed her hand on his, the gesture seemed accidental, yet perfectly timed. By the next council session, the prince's proposals mirrored her own. He began to defend her policies, arguing with his own advisors as if her words were his thoughts. Ministers watched in silence as their foreign guest transformed from skeptic to servant. In private, she watched him, quietly amused. He was not the first man to fall under her spell, but there was something different in the way he resisted it. He fought the pull, and that struggle thrilled her more than submission ever could. Late one night, as thunder rolled beyond the palace walls, she wrote in her private journal, "Power does not always require chains. Sometimes it only asks for devotion." The ink bled faintly across the page. She didn't wipe it away. Outside, the rain fell harder, washing the gardens clean of the day's softness. Inside, the queen smiled, already calculating what it would take to make the proud prince kneel. The invitations were sent weeks in advance, sealed with gold wax and the queen's personal crest, a serpent coiled around a crown. By the night of the banquet, every noble, foreign envoy, and court official within 3 kingdoms had gathered beneath the palace chandeliers. The air shimmered with perfume and expectation. The feast was not merely celebration. It was a performance of control, one only she knew the ending to. The grand hall looked like a painting brought to life. Silk banners draped from the ceiling, tables glowed with silver and crystal, and hundreds of candles turned the air into liquid gold. Musicians played softly from the balconies, their strings vibrating through the marble like whispers. At the center of it all sat the queen, radiant in crimson velvet, a jeweled collar gleaming like the edge of a blade. Prince Alaric took his seat to her right, the position of honor and of danger. His armor gleamed, his posture perfect, but the tension in his jaw betrayed unease. Around them, courtiers murmured about alliances, trade routes, the future of the crown. The queen listened, nodding gently, but her attention never left him. Midway through the feast, servants brought in a new dish, roasted quail glazed with honey and pomegranate. The scent was intoxicating. She raised her goblet and proposed a toast to peace between empires. The crowd rose with her, glasses lifted high. Her voice carried through the hall, smooth as smoke. "May trust grow where swords once crossed," she said, "and may loyalty bloom faster than vengeance." The hall echoed with applause. She smiled, her gaze sliding toward the prince. He drank deeply, the wine staining his lips a dark red. She took only a sip. Conversation turned lively again. The musicians quickened their tempo. Servants glided between tables, with trays of jewels disguised as desserts. Yet beneath the noise, small fractures began to appear. A noblewoman whispering too loudly, a minister's laughter that didn't reach his eyes. Alaric leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Your court is lively," he said. "Alive," she corrected softly, "which is more than I can say for most." He smiled, unsure if it was a jest. The music swelled, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed drenched in gold and deceit. Then a crash shattered the illusion, a cup slipping from trembling fingers at the far end of the table. The head scribe had collapsed, his face drained of color. Panic rippled through the hall. The queen rose slowly, one gloved hand lifting for silence. "Breathe," she commanded. The crowd obeyed without question. The man was carried away. The feast continued. The musicians resumed their song, though their hands shook. When the room finally settled, the queen turned to Alaric. "You see," she whispered, "even the gods envy our peace." Later, after the guests had departed and the torches dimmed, she walked alone through the emptied hall. The spilled wine looked black in the dying light, and the scent of honey hung heavy in the air. On the table where Alaric had sat, she found his goblet untouched, still half full. He had not finished his drink. She smiled faintly. The game was deepening. Some battles, she knew, were not fought with swords or poison, but with patience. And tonight, patience had tasted sweeter than victory. Beneath the palace, hidden behind a false wall in the eastern wing, lay a chamber no one dared speak of. Its entrance was a narrow arch, concealed by velvet drapes, the air thick with the smell of wax, rose petals, and something coppery that hinted at blood. Only the queen knew of it, and only she dared cross its threshold after nightfall. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves of leather-bound journals, boxes of delicate jewelry, and portraits of men whose eyes now followed her in silence. Each object was a memory, a victory, a warning. She ran her fingertips along the spines of the books, feeling the weight of secrets pressed into ink and paper. Some were letters never sent, others confessions written by trembling hands. In the center of the room stood a pedestal with a silver chalice. Its interior was still faintly stained from a recent experiment. A test of loyalty, a measure of obedience. Candles burned low around it, casting shadows that writhed across the walls like living things. She knelt, whispering names she had memorized, murmuring fragments of oaths and promises. In this chamber, she was both priest and priestess, judge and executioner. Tonight, she examined a collection of rings, each taken from a prince who had trusted her. Some were engraved with hearts, others with family crests. She held them against her chest, feeling the pulse of vanished lives in her palm. A soft sigh escaped her lips, neither sorrow nor joy, but satisfaction. She had bent their fates, guided their desires, and now kept them like stars trapped in glass. The queen moved to a wall of mirrors that stretched from floor to ceiling. Reflected hundreds of times, she saw herself as a ruler, a seductress, a specter of control. Each reflection was slightly different, younger, older, crueler, sadder. She studied them all, noting the subtle shift in her eyes each time she smiled. No one would ever see this side of her. No one could. Beneath her, a hidden compartment held notes in cipher. They detailed the fears of her enemies, the ambitions of her allies, and the intricate network of servants who reported every whispered word in the palace. She traced the lines, plotting new alliances and betrayals, her mind as sharp as any blade. A distant sound, a footstep echoing through the halls above, reminded her of the world beyond her chamber. She extinguished the candles one by one, leaving the room in near darkness, save for the faint glimmer of moonlight reflecting on her chalice. Alone, she whispered to the empty air, "Power is not in what they see, but in what they never know." And in the stillness beneath the palace, the walls seemed to listen, absorbing her secrets like obedient stone. The morning arrived like a pale warning. Fog clung to the palace turrets, curling into the hallways like living smoke. Prince Alaric, once obedient, now entered her chamber with a measured caution, his eyes sharp, calculating. Something in his expression, a flicker of defiance, drew a thrill through her spine. She had anticipated submission. She had not expected rebellion. He spoke carefully, words like drawn swords. "Your counsel is clever, Your Majesty, but not infallible. There are choices. You cannot dictate." The queen's lips curved into a faint smile, but her eyes betrayed nothing. She gestured to a chair, yet she did not sit. Instead, she circled him, slow and deliberate, as a predator observes its prey. Every step measured, every pause a question. The prince stiffened, aware of the subtle power in her movements. "I do not dictate," she replied softly. "I guide. And those who resist often fall faster than they expect." Alaric did not falter. He had studied her court, her games, her influence. He had seen men crumble, yet he met her gaze squarely. The tension between them crackled, a storm waiting to break. That evening, she orchestrated a public assembly. The council gathered to discuss border treaties and military expenditures. Alaric presented a proposal she had subtly shaped in secret, designed to test his loyalty. He refused her suggestion outright, twisting it into his own argument. The room shifted, the ministers unsure, the courtiers uneasy. The Queen's response was measured. No outburst, no public rebuke. She allowed the moment to linger, letting every eye in the chamber weigh her patience. Then, quietly, she complimented his insight, framing his defiance as wisdom. Yet in private, she noted every word, every hesitation, every flicker of ambition. Later, in the quiet of her chambers, she poured herself a goblet of wine, its surface catching the candlelight like liquid ruby. Her hand trembled slightly, not from anger, but anticipation. She had faced challenges before, but this calculated resistance was intoxicating. It demanded a new strategy, a new performance, a new darkness to bend him to her will. Alaric would not kneel easily. That much was clear. But she had never been a queen who gave up, nor one who relied solely on fear. Her seduction would become more precise, more subtle, threading through his pride and desire until the line between devotion and obsession blurred entirely. She lingered by the window, watching the palace grounds vanish in the evening mist. Somewhere below, courtiers whispered of loyalty, of obedience, of power. She smiled faintly. The prince had challenged her. But in doing so, he had only sharpened her appetite. Power, she knew, was never given. It was taken, and she would take it all. Whispers traveled faster than the wind that swept through the palace towers. A small faction of ministers and nobles had begun plotting against her, emboldened by the belief that one woman's charm could not control an empire. They met in shadowed chambers, away from her eyes, their voices sharp, conspiratorial. They spoke of alliances, armies, and exile, of stripping her of the crown she had claimed with silent calculation. The Queen, however, already knew. She had known from the moment they dared to speak aloud. Her network of eyes and ears stretched through every corridor, every servant's chamber, every echo of the stone walls. She had heard their plots, traced their loyalties, and catalogued their fears. They were not invisible. They were prey. At the next council gathering, she arrived not in crimson, as before, but in muted silver, her presence quieter yet more imposing. The courtiers shifted uneasily, their confidence faltering beneath her calm gaze. She spoke of unity, of prosperity, of the sacred duty of those who held office. Her words were gentle, almost poetic, but each syllable cut through the room with precision. Then she singled out the leader of the faction, a burly minister known for his temper and ambition. She praised him publicly, crediting his counsel for past victories, framing his loyalty as exemplary. Behind the praise, however, she planted a seed of doubt, a subtle reminder that the crown's favor was fragile, that even the most trusted could fall. His eyes flickered with unease, unnoticed by others, and in that moment, the first cracks of rebellion began to crumble. Private letters soon followed. The Queen's handmaiden delivered messages praising loyalty, offering discreet favors, or revealing hidden betrayals within the faction. By the end of the week, alliances shifted quietly. Friends turned against one another, unsure where loyalty truly lay. Fear had become a tool, sharper than any sword. Outside, the city continued as if nothing had changed. Markets bustled, children ran along the streets, and the sun reflected off the palace towers in golden brilliance. Inside, the court had become a carefully orchestrated labyrinth. Every whisper, every glance, every sigh carried meaning. Her enemies believed themselves safe until it was too late. By nightfall, the leader of the rebellion found himself summoned to the Hall of Mirrors. There, surrounded by countless reflections of the Queen, each more calculating than the last, he realized the full scope of her control. The candles flickered as he bowed, a silent acknowledgement that power, once tasted, could never be denied. The Queen watched him leave, her expression serene. Her empire, though vast, had only begun to understand the extent of her reach. She had turned their loyalty into chains, their ambition into tools. and in the stillness of the hall, where shadows danced on polished marble, she whispered a vow she would never break. Every heart that opposes me will bend or break. The garden had always been her sanctuary, a place where the scent of roses and jasmine softened the sharp edges of politics. But that night, the tranquility was shattered. A gift had arrived, a bouquet of lilies, white as the moon, their petals glistening with dew. She accepted it casually, placing the flowers in a vase in her private chamber. It wasn't the flowers themselves, but the subtle poison hidden within. An attempt on her life by those bold enough to believe they could outwit her. By the time she noticed the faint coppery scent mingling with the floral perfume, she was already preparing her counter. Calmly, deliberately, she ordered the staff to move the vase to the outer courtyard, arranging torches and mirrors to catch every shadow. When the assassin approached, masked and silent, the garden erupted in orchestrated chaos. Torches flared, illuminating fountains and statues in flickering orange light. The intruder froze, disoriented by reflections of a dozen queens moving through the garden at once. Each shadow precise, every movement a threat. The guards, already tipped off, captured him without a sound. The queen walked among the burning torches afterward, the flowers now scorched black in their iron stand. She let the petals fall to the marble floor, and the smoke rose like incense to the sky. The palace gardeners whispered of how the blooms, once symbols of life and love, now reeked of char and warning. She turned to the mirrors lining the corridor that led back to her chambers. Her reflection smiled faintly, not for survival, but for triumph. Danger had been transformed into spectacle. Her enemies would think twice before plotting again. Even whispers carried the memory of her calm, poised among flames and shadows. In the days that followed, courtiers avoided the eastern wing. They spoke in hushed tones of the burning lilies, of the queen who had walked through smoke without faltering, of the masked figure captured alive. Tales grew like wildfire, bending truth into legend. Some claimed the garden had become cursed. Others swore they saw her moving among mirrors at midnight, whispering names that belonged to the living and dead alike. And yet, she was untouched, serene, the epitome of control. She allowed herself a quiet satisfaction, knowing the garden now bore two marks, beauty and terror, forever entwined. In the palace that night, the shadows of power stretched longer than any candle, and every step in her halls reminded the court of what it meant to challenge her. The queen's gaze lingered on the horizon, where the city slept unaware. She had survived an attempt on her life, and in doing so, she had strengthened her hold. The world beyond the palace had only begun to feel the gravity of her empire. An empire that would grow from roses, fire, and fear. By the month's end, whispers in the palace corridors had taken a colder edge. The princes of neighboring kingdoms, those who had arrived full of pride and ambition, were missing. One by one, rooms were found empty, beds untouched, letters unsent. Servants murmured about sudden departures, mysterious illnesses, and journeys that seemed to vanish into thin air. The queen observed from her balcony as the city below moved unaware of the fear creeping into the palace walls. Each disappearance had been orchestrated with precision, never a trace, never a clue. She had learned the art of absence, turning vanishing into a weapon more potent than poison or sword. In the Hall of Mirrors, she reviewed the list of names, young princes who had believed themselves untouchable, who had underestimated the quiet strength of her gaze. Their faces stared back at her from portraits, lifelike and still. She traced a fingertip along each one, memorizing their expressions, storing their fear. Power, she had learned, was not in punishment, it was in uncertainty. Courtiers began to speak in softer tones. Ministers hesitated before suggesting policy. Guards exchanged nervous glances. The prince who had resisted her influence longest now walked with caution, aware that absence could strike silently, without warning. The queen's reach extended beyond her chambers. Her whispers carried through the palace like a wind that could not be blocked. One night, she summoned her chief handmaiden into the secret chamber. The girl trembled as the queen handed her a parchment of names, each one marked with a small black dot. "Ensure they remain untroubled," the queen said. Her voice was calm, almost tender. Yet the meaning was clear. Those marked would vanish, and the palace would never remember them. Outside, the moon glimmered over the gardens, untouched by human fear. Inside, shadows danced along the walls like living things, mirroring her calm calculation. Every disappearance strengthened her legend, the unseen hand behind every move in the court. Princes feared to arrive, allies feared to speak, and the empire learned a single, unspoken rule. The queen's favor could save life, and her oversight could erase it. By dawn, the first whispers of her control had reached the distant provinces. Traders and envoys passed along tales of vanished heirs, and the iron patience of the queen, who ruled in silence. Fear had become her currency, absence her signature, and in the quiet of the Hall of Mirrors, she smiled faintly. Each reflection showed a ruler, an executioner, a ghost, each one perfect, each one unseen. Her empire was no longer just land or people. It was the space between presence and disappearance, a kingdom ruled by shadows, perfume, and the sharp edge of silence. The night arrived heavy and still, the moon a pale eye watching over the palace. Torches lined the grand hall, their flames flickering against the walls like countless serpents, and the air smelled of wax, roses, and something metallic that hinted at fear. The court had gathered, unaware that this evening would mark the culmination of her control. The queen entered silently, her gown black as the void, embroidered with threads of gold that caught the torchlight like veins of lightning. A crown rested upon her head, heavier now in symbolism than in weight. Every eye turned toward her. Every whisper ceased. Even the wind outside seemed to bow. Tonight, she would test loyalty, crush rebellion, and demonstrate power not with swords, but with perception. The princes, the ministers, the envoys, all were present. They smiled, bowed, and watched, yet each of them carried the secret knowledge that one misstep could be fatal. The absence of those who had opposed her earlier was a warning none could ignore. She moved with deliberate grace among them, her gloved hands trailing along marble railings, her gaze cutting through masks and masks alike. In her wake, courtiers adjusted posture, straightened gowns, and swallowed fears they could not voice. One misdirected glance, one hesitation, and their loyalty, or their lives, hung in the balance. Then she raised her hand, signaling the start of the ceremony. Servants brought forth chalices filled with wine, the deep red glinting like blood beneath torchlight. Every cup bore a mark, subtle and invisible, a test of obedience, a measure of submission. Some drank eagerly, others hesitated. She noted each reaction, committing it to memory. Fear, devotion, desire, all mingled in the hall like perfume and smoke. The final act came swiftly. She stood at the center of the grand hall, a figure of elegance and menace, and recited the laws of her reign. Not written statutes, but unspoken rules. Obedience absolute, loyalty rewarded, betrayal extinguished. She paused at each word, letting it echo against the marble like the tolling of a bell. Every noble present felt the weight of her dominion settle upon them, inescapable and final. By the time the night ended, the court had been reshaped. Allies shifted, enemies bowed, and the empire had learned that one woman's presence could command armies, manipulate hearts, and erase opposition without a single sword drawn. Later, alone in the Hall of Mirrors, she removed her crown. Shadows flickered around her, reflections multiplying her image infinitely. She touched the glass, tracing each ghostly self, and whispered softly, "They see only what I allow. They live only because I permit it." Outside, the city slept, unaware of the complete transformation within its walls. Within the palace, power had found its purest form, invisible, absolute, and terrifyingly beautiful. The queen had become the serpent crowned, a ruler whose dominion was not just over land and people, but over fear, desire, and the very perception of reality itself. Dawn crept over the palace towers like a slow, watchful eye. Light spilled across marble floors, illuminating gold inlay and casting long, thin shadows that stretched like fingers. The courtiers moved quietly, their footsteps muted as though the very air had thickened with fear. The silence was not polite, it was obedient. Each face was pale, each gaze cautious, and the once boisterous halls now hummed with the weight of anticipation. She entered the throne room in muted silver, the fabric of her gown shimmering faintly, catching the sun in glimmers like shards of ice. Her crown rested upon her head, heavy in presence if not in weight, and every eye in the room followed her. When she spoke, it was soft, almost intimate, yet every syllable carried the force of a law. "Loyalty," she said, her voice calm as a whisper, "is not demanded. It is recognized, and those who falter vanish." A shiver ran through the assembly. The ministers, princes, and envoys shifted in their seats. Some clenched their hands beneath velvet sleeves, others bowed their heads. None dared challenge her. Not openly, not subtly. She had reshaped the court into her reflection. Composed, fearful, and unflinching. Even the guards, pillars of discipline, walked with an altered rhythm. Their movements were precise, careful, measured. They had learned to anticipate her presence. The air itself seemed to pulse with her authority, carrying her influence like an invisible tide. Courtiers no longer whispered conspiracies. They whispered praises disguised as observations. Even the most ambitious had learned to mask desire, to fold ambition into compliance. She glided between rows of seats, her movements deliberate. Every gesture, every turn of her head, every subtle tilt of her hand was calculated to reinforce control. Eyes met hers briefly, then lowered. Hearts pounded silently behind measured smiles. She watched them all, memorizing reactions, noting expressions, internalizing the delicate dance of fear and devotion. Outside the palace, the city awoke unaware of the empire bending beneath her will. Markets opened, children ran through streets, traders exchanged coin. The world seemed unchanged, ordinary, unremarkable. And yet, within the walls of her domain, everything had shifted. The balance of power had been rewritten, and she held the pen. By mid-morning, courtiers moved with almost imperceptible reverence. Decisions that once required debate were now presented for her approval alone. Even the whispers of dissent were silent, drowned beneath the tide of anticipation and fear. The palace itself seemed alive, attentive, as though stone and marble had learned to obey. In the quiet moments, she allowed herself a small, private smile. Her court had learned its place. Her enemies had been broken without a single sword, and her power had achieved an almost sacred permanence. She was no longer just a ruler. She was the axis of every gaze, every action, every thought within the palace. The day unfolded like a ritual, precise and inevitable, and in the silence that stretched across the throne room, the empire itself seemed to exhale, submitting fully to the queen who had become both shadow and crown. By midday, the reach of her power had stretched far beyond the palace walls. Provinces once restless now bowed without resistance. Governors who had murmured of rebellion sent gifts and letters of fealty, each word carefully measured, each phrase a testament to submission. The empire no longer questioned. It only followed, bending like reeds to the unyielding wind of her presence. Ambassadors arrived with folded hands and lowered eyes, presenting their offerings, gold, spices, silks, all meant to appease the queen, whose reputation now preceded her across distant lands. They spoke cautiously, careful to frame their words in praise, careful to avoid even the faintest suggestion of defiance. Each came to understand that opposition was not merely dangerous, it was inconceivable. In her private chambers, she studied maps of her dominion spread across a vast table. Every city, every fortress, every town had been accounted for. Lines drawn in ink represented not just borders, but obedience. Her fingertip traced the veins of her empire, and she imagined each movement of governors, courtiers, and armies responding silently, instinctively to her will. She did not need swords to command. Her influence alone orchestrated the empire like a symphony. Courtiers who had once dared conspire now brought advice she had already anticipated, unaware that her guidance had subtly shaped their thoughts before they spoke. Even foreign envoys followed her subtly directed suggestions, believing them their own clever insight. power she knew had become invisible. It was no longer in confrontation or decree, but in anticipation, in manipulation, in the unseen hand that guided all. The sun dipped low, gilding the palace walls and spilling amber light across the throne room. The city beyond remained ignorant of the silent conquest that had unfolded. Within the palace, every shadow, every servant's step, every whispered phrase testified to her absolute authority. The empire had surrendered not through violence alone, but through precision, patience, and the subtle terror of inevitability. At dusk, she walked the balcony overlooking the city. The wind stirred her gown, tossing strands of hair like liquid night. She inhaled the crisp air, each breath a reminder of the reach of her influence. From the highest towers to the hidden corridors, from the courtiers to the distant provinces, every soul now acknowledged her presence, whether by fear, respect, or desire. By nightfall, even the provinces that had once plotted rebellion had fallen silent. Reports of vanished conspirators, sudden obedience, and unexpected loyalty traveled like ghostly whispers through the empire. Each echo reinforced the truth. The queen's rule was total, her control absolute, and any hope of resistance now extinguished. She returned to the hall, the maps folded, the letters sealed. The empire had learned its place. Obedience was no longer demanded. It was instinct. Submission had become ritual. And as the torches flared against polished marble, she sat on her throne, calm and unchallenged, the silent axis upon which an entire empire now revolved. The queen's triumph was complete. Fear, loyalty, and desire had merged into a single, unbroken chain. And at its center sat the crowned serpent, eternal, untouchable, absolute. By nightfall, the palace had transformed into a labyrinth of quiet power. Torches flickered along the corridors, casting shadows that danced like restless spirits on polished marble. The servants moved silently, each step a ritual, each glance measured and careful. Even the air seemed to tremble, heavy with the weight of anticipation, as though the walls themselves had learned to obey her. The queen walked among them with unhurried grace. Her gown brushed the floor in whispering silk, her crown catching torchlight like a shard of obsidian fire. She paused at each archway, each corridor, allowing her presence to settle like smoke in every corner. Courtiers, guards, and envoys felt it, the subtle pressure of her will. Every heart in the palace beat to the rhythm she set, even if they did not know it. The hallways were lined with mirrors, their glass reflecting her image infinitely. Each reflection was a version of herself. Ruler, seductress, predator, ghost. She studied each carefully, noting the quiet power in the way she moved, the serenity in the control she wielded. Shadows elongated, mingled, and multiplied, creating an army of reflections that seemed to guard her silently. Whispers flowed through the corridors, not of rebellion, but of reverence and fear. Servants carried messages she had already foreseen. Ministers delivered advice she had anticipated, and even the distant provinces seemed to echo her command. Her influence had become invisible, absolute, and inescapable. In the secret corners of the palace, courtiers who once plotted against her now trembled at her presence. Letters detailing conspiracies had vanished. Plans had been subtly redirected into loyalty before they were even conceived. The queen had learned that true dominion was not in punishment alone, but in the ability to shape thought, to mold desire, to make submission seem natural. She stopped at a quiet alcove overlooking the inner gardens. The torches reflected in the water of the fountain, flickering like liquid shadows. She traced a finger along the cool stone, imagining the currents of fear, admiration, and devotion that flowed unseen throughout the empire. Every whisper, every hidden glance, every hesitation had become part of her tapestry of power. Alone, she allowed herself a faint smile. The palace was no longer just walls and halls. It was a living instrument of her will. The shadows listened, the corridors obeyed, and the empire bowed without lifting a hand. Power, she realized, had become indistinguishable from presence, and she was everywhere. The Hall of Whispered Shadows had become her dominion as much as any throne, any crown, any court. Within it, she was infinite. Within it, she was eternal, And in that quiet darkness, where only the brave dared to tread, she felt the true weight of absolute control. Unseen, unstoppable, and complete. The grand hall was silent, the air thick with wax, perfume, and the faint tang of fear. The courtiers and envoys had long since learned the rhythm of obedience, but tonight it felt almost sacred. The palace itself had become a cathedral, and she its altar. The queen moved toward her throne with measured steps, each one resonating with authority, each one a reminder that power flowed through her like blood. Her crown gleamed under torchlight, serpents coiled along its gold, their eyes catching fire with every flicker. She seated herself with unhurried grace, letting the murmurs of the court settle into silence. Her gaze swept across the hall, calm and unflinching, touching each noble, each minister, each envoy. None dared meet her eyes for long. Even glances were carefully measured, fearful of revealing thought or ambition. "Obedience is not an act," she murmured, her voice carrying across the marble. "It is a certainty, and certainty is the only law I recognize." No one interrupted. No one questioned. The room seemed suspended, as if the walls themselves bent toward her will. She had shaped not just the court, but the very souls within it. Ministers who had whispered conspiracies now served her with quiet devotion. Princes who had hoped to challenge her were gone or broken, their absence a warning carved into the memory of all who remained. Outside, the empire moved under her silent hand. Provinces had learned to obey before instruction was given. Armies stationed in distant lands acted on preemptive measures she had foreseen. The web of her control was invisible, yet absolute. Fear, loyalty, and desire intertwined, each a thread that held the empire tightly in place. She allowed herself a rare moment of reflection, eyes tracing the endless mirrors lining the hall. Each reflection multiplied her presence, a legion of herself, infinite and eternal. She touched the glass, feeling the pulse of every reflection, and whispered softly, "I am everywhere. I am inevitable. I am the crown that never falls." The torches dimmed, leaving only the soft glow of moonlight filtering through stained glass. Shadows stretched long and alive, dancing along polished marble, and the hall seemed to breathe with her authority. Her court, her city, her empire, all rested beneath her gaze. Power had become presence. Presence had become absolute, and she was the axis upon which the world now turned. She closed her eyes briefly, and in that stillness, the palace, the empire, and every soul within it acknowledged her reign. The crowned serpent, once mortal, had become eternal. Her dominion was no longer challenged, it was unquestioned. Every whisper, every glance, every fear and devotion had merged into a single, unbroken truth. She ruled alone. She ruled completely. She ruled forever. And in that silence, the Queen's eternal throne gleamed like a dark sun, unassailable, untouchable, and absolute.